unbeatable.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy 13285, and since there are no new Marvel movies coming out until either October or November, what I thought I would do is start the first part of my ultimate ranking of every single one of the 80 Marvel movies that I have seen, from my least favorite to my absolute favorite. This is going to be a ton of fun because this will not only include the MCU, but also all of the independent Marvel films that were made by other studios. I'm also including some animated films that I have seen, and remember, this is all just subjective. My list isn't the right list, it's just my personal list. We are going to disagree, and that's perfectly fine. Without further ado, let the controversy begin. So coming in last place, Venom: Let There Be Carnage. Out of all of the movies on this list, this is the movie that annoys me the most. Venom and Eddie Brock were such loathsome characters that I just wanted to strangle both of them. They are easily the worst part of this film. The humor is painfully unfunny, it really annoyed me, and the fact that I actually felt more sympathetic to not just Cletus Cassidy, but even the Carnage symbiote than I did to Eddie and Venom, ought to tell you that this is a red flag and how this movie very much crumbles. And yes, Carnage looks cool, but that's basically it. With Cletus and Shriek, they basically do the Harley Quinn Joker love story from the Suicide Squad movie from 2016. This is easily the one that annoyed me the most, so it's the one that I hate the most out of all of the Marvel movies. Coming in at number 79, Captain America from 1990. For the longest time, this was my pick for the worst Marvel movie ever made. It's cheap, it's amateurish. Sure, they get Steve Rogers' origin as Captain America pretty fairly well done, but other than that, there's like no substance or even style here. Captain America himself has zero personality. I feel I don't really know him, and he's kind of a boring character over here. The story is very boring and generic, and Red Skull is already looking bad with the red face paint, but he looks even more bad, or even worse, without it. He looks kind of like the child catcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Honestly, I had to fight myself to have this above, not in last place. However, while Venom: Let There Be Carnage is the latest Venom movie to bear Venom's name to it, we've had other Captain America movies since this one, so we can sit back and relax knowing that the character has been done justice ever since. Next up, the Fantastic Four from 1994. From my perspective, the first Fantastic Four movie is still the absolute worst, even taking out the fact that the studio only greenlit this one so that they could keep the rights to the Fantastic Four. Even taking out the fact that they didn't tell the director or the crew or the cast that this movie was never intended to be released. In fact, I would actually argue that makes it worse because the studio didn't tell them, so the crew who worked on this, the creative team, thought that it was going to be released for theatrical release before it ended up getting leaked on YouTube. That's where you can find it in case you're curious. That actually makes it worse because they didn't know, yet it's like they didn't put any effort in it. It's cheap, it's amateurish, and I could describe it in two words: boring and lame. From the costumes to the story itself to the characterization of the Fantastic Four, where they feel like blank slates just to have stuff happen. It's kind of a chore to sit through, and there isn't really much except maybe the score. That's probably the best thing I can say about this one. Number 77, Fantastic Four from 2015. Now, I think there should be very few arguments against this one being in the bottom 5. Alongside Catwoman and Mobius, this might be the most universally despised superhero film of all time, and for good reason. Now, I was late to the party on this one. I saw it about 6 years after it came out, so you can imagine by that point I had heard from critics, audiences, fans, and even the director himself how bad this film was. So when I started watching it, I thought, okay, there are some interesting ideas over here, because I do like to go into films with an open mind, but as you go through the film, as you go from one scene to the next, it seems like as if it's getting progressively worse, and the less said about the third act, the better. But I think the biggest problem is that the majority of the Fantastic Four feel as if they're just there just to make the Fantastic Four. Reed Richards is really the only person who has a purpose being there. Ben Grimm is absent for the majority of the origin, and he's only put there just by getting a phone call from Reed like, hey, I'm going on a space adventure, wanna come? Johnny's place in the film also feels very nonsensical, and the way Sue got her powers is also doesn't make sense due to her not even taking part in the time heist. I will say Michael B. Jordan's performance does elevate this film a little bit above the bottom three, but that's basically it. This is just another Fantastic failure, which is a shame because I love the Fantastic Four. They're one of my favorite superhero teams, but other than that, Fantastic is just a fantastic failure. Number 76, Venom. Yeah, I did not like the first Venom movie either, but the reason why I now consider this one to be the lesser of the two evils, unlike a lot of people who prefer the second one, is because I think it had a pretty decent setup in its opening when the symbiotes crash land to Earth, but when you cut to Eddie, it goes downhill. This movie is a complete mess. From Tom Hardy's performance, which was extremely weird, the direction is weak, the villain is absolutely forgettable in Riot, and Eddie himself is pretty insufferable, and the movie actually becomes more loathsome as you go through from one scene to another. So the first Venom movie was still very much an agonizing experience for me. Starting off the top 75 is Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance. The sequel to the 2007 film feels extremely disconnected from it, except for the fact that Nicolas Cage is still back as Johnny Blaze. However, I think the biggest problem is in the writing. Sure, the rest of the supporting characters from the 2007 film, from the first film, are not here, but other than that, the way Johnny himself, our titular character, is thrown into the story feels very lazy, if you ask me. It's just Idris Elba knocks at his door, is like, hey, I need your help, and that's it. Then he tries getting rid of his powers and then tries getting them back. What? And this can be done well. It worked well in Superman 2. Just not sure whether it works here. And it gets very weird and feels very drab. Honestly, I really just don't have strong feelings for this one. There are some nice scenes that keep this movie out of my bottom 5, but other than this, you might as well skip this one. Coming in at number 74 is Blade Trinity. Now, I'm going to give you all a heads up for when I eventually get to the other two Blade movies. I'm not as high on them as I know a lot of you are. Now, I respect for what they did for comic book movies, especially post Batman and Robin, but I'm just not the biggest fan of them, mostly because horror is not my thing, as I've said before. But with that said, even fans of the first two Blade movies can admit that Blade Trinity is just not great. It just isn't. Now, there are some good aspects to it that keep it out of my bottom 5. Jessica Biel and Ryan Reynolds, with their natural charisma, are probably the best part of this film. That's way more than I can say about the titular character. Blade might be the worst part of this film, which is a really bad thing. He looks like as if he just does not give a care. Everyone was just like phoning it in. The plot was boring, Dracula was boring as a villain, and I know it's been rumored that Wesley Snipes was apparently an absolute disaster to work on set, but I think it kind of shows, because it looks like as if he just doesn't want to be here. And the script is just very boring and honestly quite repetitive of the first two Blade films. So it may not be bottom 5 material, but yeah, this movie's pretty awful. And that will bring us to X-Men Dark Phoenix. Yes, I think the final entry in the Fox X-Men universe is the worst entry of them all. This was the second time they were adapting the Phoenix storyline, aka the most iconic X-Men storyline of all time, and yet this was the second time they completely botched it. And I think it's worse this time because it was the A-plot, it was the central focus, there was more pressure. Now, there was an interesting idea at the beginning when it goes into Jean's backstory, but it doesn't give too much development to her later on. So when she dies, it doesn't really make you feel anything. And a lot of the character decisions feel extremely weird or out of character for these versions of the characters. And the third act, well, started out fun, but when it starts to Jean Grey versus Jessica Chastain's character, and then she dies, I'm like, what just happened? and it was official that they had basically retconned the original trilogy out of the canon, and this is just a very frustrating movie. Not that I expected too much out of it after hearing the reviews, but I did want it to be better than what the reviews were saying, but unfortunately I'm just really not a fan of Dark Phoenix. Number 72, Howard the Duck. By far the weirdest Marvel movie to date, from the fact that out of all of the superheroes in the Marvel Universe, Howard the Duck gets his own movie, theatrically released at least, before Spider-Man does. Yeah, I don't get that. To the fact that the plot itself is extremely weird. The first hour is Howard landing on Earth, befriending a woman, aka Leah Thompson, and becoming her band manager, and the second half is an alien taking over human bodies and trying to conquer the Earth. Quite a tonal shift if you ask me. It doesn't help that there are a lot of weird moments that makes it feel like that they didn't know what kind of audience that they were trying to lean towards. Because on the surface level it looks like a kids film, but then you have stuff like duck condoms, duck breasts, and then you have Howard and Leah Thompson having a romantic relationship. A woman and a duck. I think I know where Ninja Turtles 2012 got it from. But with that said, while Howard the Duck has some charm to it, it is not good, like, at all. Number 71, Daredevil. Now, Daredevil's one of my favorite Marvel characters of all time, so it's very frustrating for me that this movie took everything that made Daredevil such a compelling, interesting, and cool character and made it boring. Daredevil's origin, boring. Matt Murdock, boring. Hell's Kitchen, boring. The story, boring. The Kingpin, boring. Now, while I do think a lot of the fight scenes are, for the most part, pretty well done, at the same time, that is only one piece of the puzzle. The rest is just not that great. The direction is extremely weak, and because of that, the acting suffers. The characterization, the story, they're weak, and Matt Murdock here comes off as maybe a bit of a creepy stalker to Elektra, which is a little awkward. This movie is just very frustrating and another misfire from the early 2000s superhero movies. Kicking off the top 70, Mobius. I think most of us suspected that this would end up in the bottom 20 of this list because, like I said, this is possibly the most universally despised superhero film since Fantastic, and for good reason. It is very generic and extremely bland. However, the reason why it just manages to make it out of my bottom 10 is because, for one, I do think the acting in this movie is very strong from our three main leads, whether you're talking about Jared Leto, say what you'd like about the guy, or Matt Smith, and the girl who plays the main female lead, or Mobius's love interest. And I do think it starts out somewhat interesting. It's just kind of like Fantastic. As you go from frame to frame or scene to scene, it gets worse and worse and worse. And the less said about either the third act or the mid-credit scene, the better, because the third act very much brings the movie from middle to bottom. And it's a shame because I do think the directing with the actors was somewhat okay, but the story was just very generic, and it shows how repetitive these Sony Spider-Man villain-centric movies have become. In the Venom movies, symbiote versus symbiote in the third act. In Mobius, vampire versus vampire. And it's just getting very bland. Like I said though, I think going from Venom Let There Be Carnage to Mobius was like going from Batman v Superman to Suicide Squad 2016. So, slight improvement, but still awful. Coming in at number 69, The Punisher from 1989. Now, this is the dictionary definition of a generic action movie. There is like zero personality throughout this entire movie. Now, I do give this movie a little bit of a slack compared to the movies below it, because this was one of the earlier Marvel films, so they were still trying to find their footing, but they didn't manage to make their main protagonist, i.e. Frank Castle, interesting, like what DC had done with Richard Donner's Superman, or in the same year that this movie came out, Tim Burton's Batman. And it's a shame because Frank Castle here has zero personality. He's just a guy shooting people. There are some nice scenes with the kid at the end in the third act, but the villains are extremely cartoonish and very uninteresting, so they hadn't really figured out the tone or how to balance it. Either way, you might as well just skip this one. Number 68, The Invincible Iron Man. This is just a flavorless and kind of forgettable animated movie, which is a shame because that's not what an Iron Man movie should be. I think it tried to do too many things at once, whether you talk about Iron Man's origin or the Mandarin, the mythology of him and all, and that's probably more faithful to the comics than what Iron Man 3 did, but regardless, it didn't really mash well with what they were trying to do with the origin and then all of the stuff with Stark Industries. It just felt like it was kind of all over the place creatively and tried to fit in too much. The characterization sometimes is strong, sometimes is weak. The character designs I think are cool and all. I just wish Iron Man was in his iconic suit for more than just one scene, but then he wears the other, and then they tried to do a twist which didn't really work for me. This is just a very forgettable movie if you ask me. Number 67, Ghost Rider. This is another frustrating one because I actually think the first 15 minutes of this movie is actually pretty good, and it's a good way of setting up the origins of Johnny Blaze's Ghost Rider. But then everything else feels very weird and awkward. From Nicolas Cage feeling like an awkward fit for Johnny Blaze, to the romance feeling very will they, won't they. And it also has a lot of the same problems that Daredevil has, which makes sense since they were given by the same director as those films. But also, I do think the last few minutes are okay, but there's nothing to write home about. Ghost Rider is not a terrible film, it's just a bad film with some good elements. 66, Punisher Warzone. Now I do feel a little bad ranking this movie as low as it is due to the passing of Ray Stevenson this year, the lead actor of this film. But I'm just not the biggest fan of this one. There were some good elements to it. I think the stuff of Frank Castle killing a widow's husband was interesting, but it's also derailed by Jigsaw trying to get back at Frank Castle, and maybe the over-the-top violence feels very just not my thing. Either way, there are some good elements in here. I think the stuff between Frank Castle and the widow and her son was okay, but I don't think you really know Frank Castle in this film too well. There are glimpses of his origin, but he feels a little underdeveloped. Either way, this is not necessarily a terrible film, it's just a mediocre film for me that's just not my thing. Coming in at number 65, X-Men Apocalypse. Now, I had enjoyed all of the X-Men movies from one degree or another up to this point, but Apocalypse was that first one I was like, I did not enjoy that movie. Now, there are some good elements that put it above all the ones that are below it. I think Evan Peters was clearly having a lot of fun, and this is the best Quicksilver has been in the Fox X-Men movies thus far because he was given a lot of screen time, and I really enjoyed it, especially him going very slow motion where the time is slow and he is being fast. I actually think it's better than an X-Men Days of Future Past, but everything else just feels very bland. Apocalypse feels like a very one-note and bland villain when he should be big and bombastic and a big threat like how he is in the comics. And a lot of the new X-Men characters, just when it looked like as if we were getting to know them, it feels very rushed and you don't really know them, and the way Havoc is written out just did not do it for me at all. So there are some high highs. I think the performances are still great, but it's mostly a bunch of low lows for the X-Men franchise. Number 64, Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse. In the near 3-year history of this channel, out of all of the controversial opinions I've shared here, by far, the one that has gotten me possibly the most hate and negative feedback has been my take on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. People have said I've had awful taste, or that I shouldn't be trusted, but I still stand by my opinion. I just don't like this movie. For a lot of people, it was this visually stunning, amazing animated film that taught anyone that everyone can wear the mask, anyone can be Spider-Man, And I can see why, because it was a literal line in the movie.
Anyone can wear the mask. You could wear the mask.
However, for me, that message felt as if it was just shoehorned in there, as I felt they never really earned it. They only gave the standout moments to Miles. If they wanted to prove that anyone can wear the mask, anyone can be Spider-Man, then why not give standout moments to all of the Spider people? Which brings me to my biggest problem with this movie. It felt like they had mashed a Miles Morales origin movie with a Spider People team-up movie, and the mash didn't really go as well as I imagined the creatives had wanted, as Miles felt out of place in the Spiderverse aspect of this movie, while the other Spider People felt out of place in Miles' origin in the movie, and it detracted from some other stuff that they had set up earlier, such as Miles trying to struggle fitting into his new boarding school. It's like they walked in with two different scripts for two different Spider-Man movies, a Miles Morales movie and the Spider-Verse origin movie, team-up movie I mean, and they tripped, mixed up all the papers like, oh, let's just do all of it.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
And while I know for a bunch of you it definitely paid off, and to be fair, there are elements of a good film in here and good ideas, for me, the execution just did not do it for me. Number 63, Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse. Because of my unpopular opinion on the first Spiderverse movie, you were probably all curious on how I felt about its sequel. Well, here you go. Here it is. I think Across the Spiderverse is better than Into the Spiderverse, but unfortunately not as by much as I'd hoped it would be. Now, credit when it's due. Something I forgot to mention in terms of positives towards Into the Spiderverse was the animation and music. I thought they were phenomenal, and not only were they great in Across the Spiderverse, but I would argue they were actually better, which was a great thing. They took what worked about the first film and ran with it here and improved on it. And in terms of creative decisions, I think in terms of character, there are actually some things that were an improvement, in particular with Gwen Stacy. In the first film, she was clearly just a blank slate to give Miles a love interest, and I've never been a fan of the Miles-Gwen ship, honestly. But here, she feels like her own character, and her story with her dad and the amount of grief she was going through feels very much better here, and I enjoy it more. I actually got invested. In fact, if this was a full-on Gwen Stacy movie, where she was the main character, I might have actually said this was a good film. But here's the thing, Miles is still first and foremost the main character, and a lot of his story bogs this film down. I didn't really get invested in the father-son stuff with his dad in the first film, but they do the same thing here with both of his parents, and it really got annoying after some time with them constantly arguing. I just wanted to move to the next scene, and the movie just keeps taking Miles' side. Now, in terms of tone, these movies are very much like the Ninja Turtles 2012 show, which I'm sorry I did not like, but the second half of this movie felt like an episode of Power Rangers Time Force, another show that, contrary to a lot of Power Rangers fans, I did not like at all. And here is the evidence in terms of characterizing both Miles and Miguel O'Hara.
Your actions here have caused history to be altered.
You're the original anomaly!
Maybe it was. But the future isn't written in stone. We each make our own destiny. Wrong.
No! You're lying! I'm Spider-Man!
You're a mistake!
And while the Spiderverse aspect of this film doesn't feel like an afterthought like it did in the first film, it actually feels more organic and feels as if it blends into this film a bit more. A lot of the plot points set up in this film didn't really get resolved. And sure, there's Beyond the Spider-Verse, but they could have still resolved some of them. Look at the Back to the Future movies. While setting up future films, they still resolve plot points in those respective films. Look, if you love this film, great, but for me,
well, agree to disagree.
Coming in at number 62 is Blade 2. And this is exactly why I had given you the heads up on how I feel about the Blade films as a whole, because I'm just not the biggest fan of Blade 2. It's not a terrible film, it's fine, it's well made, but it also feels very repetitive of the first film. and that's about it. You have vampire hunting again, and sure, they have this whole intrigue that apparently if you're bitten by these new vampires, you get turned into one as opposed to die, but wasn't that something that was established in the first Blade film? And a lot of the side characters didn't really appeal to me. Blade felt like he was in the same position that he was at the end that he was of the first film, and Whistler I felt didn't need to be there. It was just a very forgettable film. Again, if you love this film, I'm happy for you, but you know how I feel about horror, so Blade 2 just isn't for me. And finally, at number 61, Spider-Man 2. Now, I know for a fact that this is a lot of people's favorite Spider-Man movie, maybe more so than either Spiderverse movies. Heck, I've even spoken to people who've said that this is, to this day, still their favorite comic book movie. So probably seeing Spider-Man 2 in the bottom 20, my bottom 20, is probably making you go,
pretty much the worst video ever made.
So at least hear me out before you have a go at me in the comments below. Now, I grew up with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. They were possibly my first introduction to Spider-Man, and I really liked Spider-Man 2 growing up. And if you were to ask me back when I was like 9, I would have had this in my top 10 favorite Marvel films. However, I feel like this movie hasn't aged particularly well, and each time I go back to it, I think over time I actually like it less. Which is a shame because I want to like it more, because I would say this is possibly the most frustrating Spider-Man film to date, because there are still things that hold up. The visual effects, the action sequences, enough said about the train scene, the acting I think still holds up. I think it's overall the actual characterization and the execution of the storytelling that doesn't hold up. On paper, I really like the idea of adapting possibly the most iconic Spider-Man story of all time, Spider-Man No More, and it's one of my personal favorites, because that is a great way of challenging the power and responsibility angle of Spider-Man. However, I feel like the execution is where it falls a little flat. Now, this isn't me comparing it to the comic, it's just me judging it as a film, and it ends up just being okay. Like I said, good concepts, but I think not very great execution. Alfred Molina is clearly having a lot of fun as Doc Ock, but I also felt his origin was kind of a bit of a rehash of the Green Goblin in the first film, where he had kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, a voice in his head telling him what to do. And the Peter and Mary Jane romance very much dragged this film down, and I think I'm stressing on this because it's more of a big deal than some people make it out to be. It's very much the driving force of this film, and his powers going away made no sense because he was feeling bummed out and it was taking away from his personal life. I felt that was not needed. I don't know why that was put, and all it really comes down to as well is similar to Superman Returns, where it kind of regressed Peter from where he left off at the end of the first Spider-Man film, where he was letting Mary Jane go, but now he's begging for her. It just didn't do it for me. Again, I want this movie to go up, but as of now, it's just a middle of the road film. It's okay, has good moments, but I think there are more flaws than people make it out to be. So there you have it, true believers. That was the first part of my ultimate ranking of every single Marvel film that I have seen, from my least favorite to my absolute favorite. This is the bottom 20, and let me know in the comments below what is your bottom 20 if you've seen 80 or more Marvel films. Do you like my list? Do you hate my list? Whatever it is, let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe for more if you enjoy my content. I talk Marvel, Ninja Turtles, Sonic the Hedgehog, Power Rangers, Percy Jackson, occasionally DC and Mario. So if that is anything up your alley, this is the place for you. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with part 2 of my Marvel movies ranked, hopefully very soon. Remember, trust your own judgment, and I'll see you next time. SoDeem285, out.
If the world chooses to become my enemy, I will fight like I always have.